Okay, good evening, colleagues. Thank you so much, Dr. Hussein, for the invitation. This is the second time that I'm coming through. The last time I was sharing with colleagues on ICT integration practices in South Africa. Today, I will be sharing on the use of online assessments for teaching and learning within the professional development of teachers. So the courses that we develop basically are developed from the UNESCO ICT CFT framework. But what I would want to touch on particularly with this particular presentation is to look at the theoretical aspect, which becomes the philosophy behind the online assessments, as well as to look at the different tools of online assessment and how they can be applied within teaching and learning. So I'll straight go on into my introduction, where we are basically saying anything that has to do with education or teaching and learning has to be discussed currently within the COVID-19 context. I think the whole world is currently affected by COVID-19, which has resulted in different governments taking on different measures just to mitigate against the spread of this virus. And what it has basically entailed for different education systems is the fact that schooling has been redefined. If you look at the South African context, we've got three avenues with which any individual can basically access schooling. The first one being public schooling, which is available to everybody, whether affluent or exposed or poor. Then we've also got what we call independent schooling, which is available for anybody, but usually it is characterized by, I think, high tuition fees for one to actually access education. Then the last one is homeschooling, which has also become very popular in the current context, where most parents are basically providing teaching and learning from home. But also within the context of public schooling within which we operate ourselves, we have come up with what we call lockdown learning, which is a bit different from what you would call homeschooling. With lockdown learning, our focus is basically to provide what I would call out of school support for teachers and learners. Our current solution before the COVID-19 was in classroom oriented, where we were looking at how a tech-enabled classroom that focused on the teacher in terms of providing the teacher with the necessary tools and features to basically deliver the curriculum. It also focused on the learner in terms of also providing learners with digital resources for them to be able to access content, as well as have what we would call meaningful learning through individualized pathways on the online learning platform. But also in terms of the curriculum itself, which is the design of the learning space, we looked at how we could make this particular tech-enabled environment conducive enough for teachers to be able to deliver the curriculum. But what is central, I think, with the current context is the fact that you notice that different education departments have been forced to either revise their existing curriculum or to look into how certain subjects could be reduced so that learners are able to complete the year and progress to the next grade. But central to everything which is happening is how assessments are being reviewed, and also how teachers are basically practicing these different assessment practices in schools. So as we go on, we are operating with what I would call a technology-enabled development model, which we also took from the ICT CFT, but we've adapted it to the South African context. So our professional development model is based on what you call the SACE competence, teacher competencies on the use of digital resources, which are about 18. And what we managed to do was to package these different competencies into 3 core components, which is professional knowledge, professional practice, and professional engagement. But all what we are trying to develop within a teacher is basically how we can practice or do professional teacher development and provide a better learning experience for these teachers, but also looking at how these different technologies can be utilized in order to enhance the learning experience of different learners, and also making the teacher's job a bit easy. But the tools and resources themselves do not necessarily make or deliver an effective learning environment. What does that are the cognitive outcomes that we envisage within the curriculum. And what we are basically saying is that for effective learning to take place within the online learning environment, we need to be focusing on what you would call the higher thinking skills, which you would find within your Bloom's taxonomy. So there is less focus currently on the lower levels of the Bloom's taxonomy, which focuses on your remembering and comprehension skills. Currently, the use of these technological resources should enable different education departments to structure their curriculum to focus more on the higher order thinking skills, which are around analysis, evaluation, synthesis, as well as creating a new environment. But in terms of the learning journey that we are trying to do, if you look at this particular slide, you'll look at my far right, where I'm actually moving my cursor. This is your Bloom's taxonomy, which starts from remembering, understanding, application, analysis, evaluation, and creating. And we are saying, how do you develop your teachers, those that are at a foundation level in terms of utilizing ICTs, so that they are able to operate at a higher order thinking, where they're able to either not just adapt materials, but create digital resources for teaching and learning, utilizing formative assessment, which is a key driver in active learning within the classroom. So we are saying in terms of our adoption phase, teachers will begin with the utilization, obviously, of your hard copies before you introduce them to your online texts or digital assignments, which is a skill, still lower level within understanding. But as these teachers develop their confidence on the use of the digital resources, they shift to the application of this particular knowledge, where the focus now becomes on the use of adaptive learning tools, as well as developing inner learning experience, which is more personalized based on personal pathways. But the goal where we are thinking we should be going is for us to envisage teaching as a design science, where the focus is on developing your design thinking skills. Because for us to be able to effectively teach and make learning effective, we need to be utilizing problem-based approaches or project-based approaches that enable learners to be able to identify problems. And through the use of digital resources, including coding or robotics on one hand, our teachers should be able to find solutions for the problems that would have been identified within a particular learning context. So within the Matthew Goniwe School of Leadership and Governance, we are utilizing a needs-oriented teacher development strategy. If you are aware, if you are aware of different teacher development strategies, for one to be able to develop a program, one needs to base it on a specific philosophical position. And there are two philosophical positions that people can basically take. One is deterministic, where you look at where the education should be going in terms of the future, where you try and forecast the future, or you can utilize what I would call an adaptive teaching strategy, where you adapt whatever training model or needs to the current context which we find ourselves. And I believe within our own context, we are adapting our material to the context that we find ourselves. So for us to be able to identify the desired and critical developmental needs of our different teachers, we've developed what we call a track selection tool, where most of our courses have been uploaded onto the platform, and teachers answer a series of questions. So they answer a series of questions in order to determine which professional development course they will need to adopt. And this particular tool, based on the critical and desired needs identified, places a teacher on a specific program online. So this is how we are enhancing our online learning experience, or one might also call it the aspect of machine learning in this particular case, which certain people feel is still at a conceptual stage and not yet practically implemented. But this is how we are adapting a needs-driven training approach for our different teachers. But my main focus today is on how we can basically utilize formative assessment, online formative assessment, to drive active learning within the classroom. And I'll start off from a theoretical perspective, in the sense that whether you've got online resources available or not available, assessment itself has been seen as what we would call a black box. You know, a black box from the aeroplane. So we aren't able to tell the impact or effect of assessment within the classroom. In our case in South Africa, it is because we've got policies that basically place restriction on education officials in terms of assessing teacher practices within our own schools. So we find it difficult to basically assess the teacher practices of our teachers as they practice within the classroom based on the current policies that we have. But what I want us to look at basically is the fact that the main argument is that teaching and learning should be interactive. But how do you make it interactive using formative assessment? Because there are different models that people have adopted. Currently, we're talking of the ICT CFT, which is basically structured into 3 phases with 3 learning journeys, starting with your technological literacy, going to knowledge deepening and knowledge creation, but also looking at the levels of professional development which it focuses on. It starts off with your policy framework, it goes on to the theoretical frameworks, it goes on to the teacher content that is required to teach specific subject. It also looks at the pedagogy as well as the assessment, which are key within the teaching and learning platform. So basically what we need to understand is that assessment refers to all activities undertaken to provide information about the progress of a learner. So within the process of teaching and learning, assessment is utilized to identify misconceptions within the learning process. But what's also important is how a teacher should be utilizing the assessment feedback to actually correct or amend the identified misconceptions. So there are 3 questions that we need to be asking ourselves around the process of assessment. The first one being, is there evidence that improving formative assessment raises standards in terms of teacher or learner performance? Is there evidence that there is room for improvement? Is there evidence about how to improve formative assessment? So now, in order for us to be able to raise these particular standards, I think one needs to delve deeper into literature. In this particular case, I consulted Black and Wilson on the different assessment practices in terms of how enhancing feedback could improve pedagogic practice, how one could actually improve active learning, and how results can actually be attained from the use of assessment. But you'll notice that because assessment is located within policy and a political framework within the education system, Black and William basically talk of what we call a poverty of practice as well as an empty commitment. It's a poverty of practice in the sense that we've not explored fully how assessment can actually affect teaching and learning within the classroom, as I've already talked about it. Assessment is at times perceived to have a negative impact within the learning process. That's how some people actually perceive it. But also the role, the management role from an instructional point of view, as well as from an institutional point of view, leaves a lot of gap. While we promise so much in terms of improving assessment practices, but in terms of the actual practice that we espouse, there is little that we are doing. It becomes an empty commitment because from a policy perspective, what the policy actually enacts and how we get to espouse or practice that particular policy, there is also room because that particular gap has actually not yet been filled. The reason why I'm bringing the two up is because when you look at assessment, assessment has got two components to it. We have what we call summative assessment, where you basically assess or measure learning after a long or a duration period of time. Then we've got formative assessment, which is assessment for teaching and learning that should be done within the process of teaching and learning. So that empty commitment comes in to say that currently, as we are facing COVID-19, is it possible that our school living grades can actually be tested on the online platforms, have an online final school living examination, either for a diploma or for a matriculation certificate? That is still yet to be done, even though the necessary tools have been provided for us to look at. So what are some of those big ideas that we need to be focusing on, as well as the learning environment? I think we need to be looking at the use of formative assessment from a theoretical and pedagogic point of view, with less emphasis on the utilization of different tools. So I'm looking at the big ideas from the way that the question banks are basically developed. I'm looking at it from how feedback in terms of diagnosis within the process of teaching and learning is also enabled. We're also looking at it from a collaboration point of view, which is how do you enhance that peer and self-assessment during the process of teaching and learning. Peer assessment is easier to do on the online platform. So is self-assessment, where different tools can actually be used to enable that personalized learning or promote personal learning pathways. Then we also look at the use of formative assessment to do summative tests within the curriculum. So this is how I believe we could be able to raise standards for learning in terms of teacher professional development. But how do you improve the use of online learning for teachers? So you are looking at the role of the teacher to say, how do you change teacher beliefs or teacher perceptions on the use of online resources for teaching and learning? And for self-assessment, because as a teacher, the teacher needs to do a lot of reflection in and on practice. So a teacher needs to reflect a lot in order for them to be able to perfect their craft of teaching. Because once you have been given a license to teach, the assumption is that you've got the content knowledge, you've also got the pedagogic knowledge for teaching and learning. But in terms of structuring the lesson now, because I'm going to the practical components of utilizing either a Moodle platform, as you were talking, or an LMS, now you are saying you need to basically base the utilization of technologies onto the curriculum. From the curriculum, you select your topic. You also select your sprints, which is the conversations that will basically be used for feedback within the platform or through your forum discussions. Then you also need to look at the learning objects that can be used formatively. In this particular case, you can have a pre-quiz, a video, SCORM, readings, and post-assessment utilizing different tools. But from a timetabling or structuring or pacing point of view for a lesson, one needs to look at a quiz in terms of utilization of pre-assessments within the process of teaching in the online platform. A poll can be used in terms of scenario analysis. Videos can also be used for timetabling content in terms of speed, distance, and time calculations, tutorial content, as well as the quizzes. Now, what I would want to look at now in the next session of this particular workshop is to look at the use of what I would call the Smart Lab, which are different tools and resources for doing assessment for learning. So now within this particular platform, which can be adapted whether to your learning management systems such as your Moodle, Edmodo, Blackboard, you will find something similar to what you call a monster quiz, fill in blanks, which are your question banks, a response item, flip out, match them up, ranking order in terms of the questions that you set, labeling of different diagrams. You can also utilize what I would call shout out, which is good also in terms of your forum discussions. You can also use super sort. But over and above this, one can also utilize a web quest. One can also utilize a cyber hunt as a form of assessment within teaching and learning. So this is an example of fill in blanks where you can actually design or develop your assessment task where a learner simply either drags and drops a particular question item or question bank, or they can actually fill in the missing item online. It could be on a learning management system, or it could be through a learning application such as your Smart Note or your IQ Education. So this is a response item where you can use Google Forms or Microsoft Forms to basically do your online assessments. So there's also what we call the flip out, where flashcards can be utilized to sort and also respond to the different assessments that could be set in different subject areas that are identified. There is also the matching of concepts where learners can basically match different concepts. This you can also find on Google Classroom, Microsoft Learning Suite, and different what you call this learning management systems. They also utilize this particular tool or application. Learners can also rank different answers or question banks in terms of responding to different questions that might be required from a curriculum point of view. There's also sorting of different questions as well as answers. Then there's what we call the shout it out. This is also another feature that you would find in different applications that also enables that active learning within teaching and learning. Learners can also label different diagrams. It could be an image. It could be given in the form of a video. They can also drag an image and also label it differently. So these are some of those tools that can be utilized for online assessment. I wanted to make this particular session a bit more interactive for us to be able to look at some of these particular tools, but because of the time constraints that we have been given, I'm unable to do so. So I've decided to go with the static presentation of online assessments. I'm not so sure whether there are any questions with regards to this particular topic that I have presented on. Thank you so much, Dr. Hussein.
Thank you so much, Mr. Handson. I think that your presentation is very useful to us. Please, our teachers can ask about this presentation, please.
May I ask, please? Um, First of all, thank you for your presentation. I took some notes. Can you hear me well?
Yes, I can hear
Yeah,
you.
okay.
I can hear you.
I took down some, some applications that you use for digital ways of assessment. Smart Lab is one of them. Which ones do you use more often than others? Let's ask. For example, in Turkey, we mostly use, for testing things, Socrative, Kahoot, quizzes, these type of, quiz applications. What do you use in your schools in there, or your teachers?
Okay, so in South Africa, our government heavily invested on digital technologies. So you notice that our solution is targeted at three aspects, like I mentioned. So the focus is on the classroom, where we are utilizing interactive whiteboards. So the interactive whiteboards have been loaded with the Smart Lab or Smart Notebook application. Some of them have been loaded with what you call the IQ education software. So these are softwares that enable us to actually deliver the curriculum within the classroom for mediating teaching and learning.
Smart Lab is for South Africa's use only, or is it free to use for every country? What do you think?
It's free to utilize, but your government has to pay a license for it.
Okay, I see.
So we're paying a license for that so that we can improve the learning experience within our classrooms. Then teachers have an option now, because you've got in-classroom intervention that you have to do as a teacher as you deliver your curriculum. Then you have got the out-of-school intervention that you need to give also to your learners while they are working from home. So if it has to do with out-of-school support, then our teachers are free to utilize Microsoft Teams. So currently we're doing Microsoft Teams as a means of providing out-of-school support, because it has got a learning management system that can give you synchronous communication and also asynchronous learning within that particular platform. But Google Forms are also popular with some teachers in terms of either collecting different data for assessment.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot.
Arkadaşlar buyurun. Evet, Pelin Hocam buyurun.
Hello, Mr. Hassan. Thank you for your presentation. It was really useful for us. I was wondering, especially about formative assessment, because in Turkey, in our classrooms, we used to use summative assessments mostly. So in your presentation, I saw that we can change summative formats to formative assessments. How do you do that? How I couldn't just think about it. How do you use summative assessment tools for formative assessments? How can we change them?
Oh, okay. I think in my presentation, I spoke about what I called a poverty of practice, because it's a policy issue. Because the purpose of assessment is not necessarily to measure learning within the school. Remember, when you assess learners, assessment, especially if you take it from a summative point of view, you are basically interpreting learning as an event. You get what I'm saying? You're interpreting learning as an event, whereas what we are trying to improve is the thinking capacity and problem-solving capacity of our learners. So if you are going to treat learning as an event, it also means that from a philosophical point of view, your perception of knowledge or of intelligence is that intelligence is fixed. So if intelligence is fixed, it simply means that the way you get to assess people at the end of their schooling year, you condemn these particular learners to say, once you fail either your school leaving diploma or certificate, it simply means that you can never be anything. Whereas we need to be interpreting assessment as part of improving learning within teaching and learning. You get what I'm saying? So if we are to interpret summative, if we are to include summative assessment in formative assessment, where you are saying whatever learners do each and every day actually counts for their final school leaving certificate or grade progression, then in that particular aspect, you are encouraging your learners not only to be failures, but to improve from their learning. I don't want to use disability, but from their learning deficiencies.
Okay. So can we say that for summative assessment tools mostly do learners to think that to think about grades mostly instead of thinking learning?
Yes.
Okay.
You see, the problem is summative assessment also influences directly on teacher practices. It influences teacher practices in the fact that teachers begin to teach for the test instead of teaching for understanding. Remember, in the current context that we find ourselves, we need to be improving the higher order thinking skills of our learners, if you are to use the Bloom's taxonomy, and focus less on lower level thinking skills. So that is why I'm saying that governments need to change their assessment policies so that they incorporate certain summative aspects onto formative assessment of teaching and learning.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Handson. Really, your presentation is very nice. Thank you so much.
No, thank you so much, Dr. Hussein. It's always good to be invited, particularly to this platform, and share our experiences and how we perceive learning and education from different parts of the world.
Thank you.